The QR code on the left covers all the AWS service descriptions that we'll discuss today. Basically provides you a definition for each of them so that you can reference that document. The one on the right is the Security Hub integrations. Security Hub ingests and also sends data to different AWS services and third-party solutions. All right. So I am Manny Landron, and I'm with the Line Technology Group, an AWS Cloud and Security Advisory Services partner, headquartered here in Raleigh, North Carolina. I help organizations assess, secure, monitor their platforms and applications on premises and in cloud. I want to thank Devon Carter and the Triangle InfoSecOn Conference Committee for the opportunity to speak to you today. I've been an active member of ISSA for over 15 years now. I do credit the organization and its members for positively influencing my career. You know, a strong ISSA chapter is key to enabling the next generation of security practitioners, and few organizations actually do it as well as the Raleigh ISSA. If you don't know, the ISSA conference, this conference is actually put on by the local chapter. This is not the national conference. Today, I'll provide you an overview of the Amazon Web Services Reference Architecture. You'll hear me reference it as the AWS SRA. I emphasize that this isn't intended to be a master class on the AWS SRA, but an introduction to key areas of cloud security that really will benefit anyone regardless of their knowledge of cloud security, their knowledge of Amazon Web Services. I do assume that you come here with some foundational understanding of cloud concepts, some foundation of information security concepts and terminology, but really it's not necessary to digest the message. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today and focus our attention on some important concepts applicable to the AWS SRA, as well as the organizational structure of the reference architecture and its corresponding accounts. We're going to highlight the AWS security foundations, including the AWS Cloud Adoption Framework, the AWS Well-Architected Framework, and the AWS Shared Responsibility Model. We're going to also cover some important concepts regarding identity and access management and the multi-account strategy. You may have heard about the multi-account strategy. My hope is that you come away from this talk fully understanding what that means and how it benefits you and your organization. So the AWS Security Reference Architecture is a living document. It's really a set of guidelines. It's not intended to be prescriptive. It can be if you want it to be. I encourage you to evaluate the proposed approach. Use it as a reference to adopt aspects of the architecture that are relevant to you and your organization. So the SRA aligns with the Cloud Adoption Framework, the AWS Well-Architected Framework, and the AWS Shared Responsibility Model. So the Cloud Adoption and Well-Architected Frameworks are essentially best practices that propose a set of security perspectives and design principles that we're going to cover at a high level next. The AWS Shared Responsibility Model describes the shared responsibility between a tenant, a customer, and AWS within the context of security and compliance. So these are the perspectives promulgated by the AWS Cloud Adoption Framework. So this is going to help you achieve the traditional confidentiality, integrity, availability goals associated with safeguarding your data and your cloud workloads. It consists of the 9 capabilities you see on the screen here. These perspectives ought to be very familiar to you as they are basic tenets of a healthy and sustainable information security program. So we'll address identity and access management considerations in a few. So where the AWS Cloud Adoption Framework provides these security perspectives or frames the overall security strategy, the well-architected principles describe where to start, with an emphasis on things like identity and access management, logging, monitoring, detection and response, automation using infrastructure as code, right? Either through CloudFormation or Terraform, and then protection of data in transit, at rest, and in some cases in use. Here, this diagram may be very familiar to some of you. It is the standard diagram that AWS uses to reflect that AWS is responsible for security of the cloud, while the customer, the tenant, is responsible for security in the cloud. In other words, AWS is responsible for protecting the infrastructure that runs all the services offered as part of the AWS cloud, while the customer is responsible to secure and monitor the systems, the applications, the code, the data that runs in the cloud. The only exception would be serverless. So serverless is a cloud-native development model that essentially allows developers and engineers to build and run applications without really having to manage the underlying operating system. Lambda, which we'll talk about later, is the prime example of serverless. So this is a very important slide. Here's where we talk about the multi-account strategy that you may have heard discussed. The concept of a multi-cloud strategy is key to understanding how best to organize around the work necessary to ensure that your organization's long-term success with respect to sustainable cloud adoption. And I emphasize sustainable cloud adoption. It just makes it a lot easier to secure your environment, a lot easier to monitor your environment, a lot easier to do budget forecasting and that sort of thing. So AWS organizations enable you to configure AWS services that apply to all accounts. For example, you can configure centralized logging using CloudTrail to collect event logs for all accounts. More on this later. So grouping accounts into organizational units enables you to attach a policy-based control to an organizational unit, an OU, so that all accounts within that OU automatically inherit that policy. Sounds familiar? Sounds like Active Directory, doesn't it? Yeah. So keep in mind that by default, no access is allowed between accounts, none whatsoever. Access must be explicitly granted, configured, right? This approach enables you to organize workloads in separate accounts and group accounts based on function or requirements, as opposed to what many organizations do, where they structure their accounts based on company structure, right? Marketing workloads belong to marketing, right? That's really tough to manage. And you'll hear this as a recurring theme throughout the talk. We're going to talk about separating these workloads in their own accounts to enforce security, compliance, access, and billing boundaries, right? Remember that a workload is the code and AWS resources that comprise your application or system. I can't emphasize enough that segmenting your workloads will make it much easier to categorically or granularly apply security, compliance, and access requirements, as well as determine the cost of running a specific workload. That's important because you want to be able to facilitate budget forecasting, cost control, chargebacks, and that sort of thing. So IAM, or Identity and Access Management principles are users, groups, and roles. So again, principles are users, groups, and roles. And these are principles to which access and permissions are granted. Principles can do absolutely nothing within an AWS environment until you actually give them permissions, right? So you're noticing a theme: deny by default, no access by default. You actually have to provision access in order for that principal to have access. Service control policies enable permission boundaries, often referred to as guardrails, right? And the default configuration supports service control policies as these deny lists. And so deny lists within the context of AWS are shorter in nature. They are easier to maintain because they're shorter, right? And can be applied conditionally. That's an important point. Again, deny statements are shorter, easier to maintain, and can be applied conditionally. And these represent the guardrails within your AWS environment, within your AWS organization. Trusted access enables trusted services to perform tasks within your AWS organization. You can, for example, and I'm using this example again, leverage trusted access to grant the CloudTrail service, trusted access to create an organizational trail, in all accounts managed by the AWS organization. And the organizational trail is that logging mechanism that ingests all the logs from every account. The AWS SRA delegates administration of security-related services to the security tooling account. We'll discuss that security tooling account later. Delegating administration of a service is really easy to do. It's as easy as typing the account ID of the account to which you want to delegate administration from within the AWS console configuration page associated with that service, right? Last, and a very important concept, AWS Control Tower automates the setup of this thing called a landing zone. A landing zone is basically based on best practices blueprints. It applies guardrails, it automates account provisioning, and by account, I don't mean user account, I mean AWS account, right? A landing zone is essentially a well-architected, multi-account AWS environment that is the starting point from which you can deploy workloads. And again, a workload is an application, a system, a backend system, a service, what have you. So now we'll discuss the organizational units and the corresponding accounts described within the AWS SRA. Remember, the SRA is a guideline. It's not meant to be prescriptive. Take from it what you will. Many organizations do rely on third-party commercial off-the-shelf or open source solutions and tools. Often those solutions or tools are procured through the AWS marketplace. So that they ought to account for integrate the customized approach, right? What I'm trying to say there is that it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to stop using commercial off-the-shelf or open source tools. If you have a service in AWS that does the same thing, you can pick and choose what you want to accomplish, right? And we'll talk about Security Hub in a minute and how Security Hub facilitates that. So I provided you a list of all the third-party solutions and that QR code that integrate with Security Hub and the type of integrations it supports. But please reference the AWS marketing site for the latest Security Hub integrations. So the org management account hosts the root of the AWS organization. This is where you apply those service control policies we talked about earlier, right? To ensure that member accounts stay within their prescribed account governance structure and access control guidelines. That governance structure and those access control guidelines are essentially what you hear people call guardrails, right? It enforces guardrails. Remember that service control policies don't grant permissions, right? They only affect member accounts and not the management account itself. Again, service control policies do not grant permissions. They only limit permissions, right? And they only affect the member accounts and not the management account itself. You don't want to accidentally lock yourself out of specific permissions by applying it to the member account. The management account hosts the CloudTrail organization trail, and all events associated with the event logs are stored in one S3 bucket. Systems Manager is an operational management tool, but you can also use it to manage specific AWS services, including EC2 instances. So for example, you can use it to patch your EC2 instances. AWS IAM Identity Center is formerly known as AWS Single Sign-On. I personally prefer AWS Single Sign-On. That's a mouthful what they got going on there. And it can serve as your identity source. Many of you use Okta or some other identity source. Very similar approach, right? It enables federation to member accounts, applications, services, including third-party software as a service apps. Although the name service, or rather, although the service name AWS Single Sign-On has been deprecated, the term single sign-on is still widely used within AWS documentation. AWS config enables you to provide service last accessed information that you can use to audit and manage account permissions, or rather principal permissions, right? Principals are users, groups, and resources, right? And so you can essentially use it to audit and manage permissions over time. Performing some degree of cloud infrastructure entitlement management is a term in the industry. Cloud infrastructure entitlement management. AWS Artifact is an easy way to get a hold of AWS compliance documents, including SOC 2 reports, PCI AOCs, ISO certifications, that sort of thing. Your client or you as the client would have to sign the AWS NDA. And then you have access to AWS Artifact where you can download those SOC reports for your review, especially if you're doing third-party access, because you know AWS doesn't really respond to questionnaires, right? AWS Control Tower, again, automates the setup of that landing zone. It provides an integrated dashboard where you can see top-level summaries of policies, service control policies that you've applied. Remember those guardrails that you've applied to the AWS environment? So using Control Tower, you can apply those guardrails, automate AWS account provisioning, the guardrails enabled across your accounts, the account level status for compliance, and your guardrails overall, right? You can use it to view what you have applied, right, what you have enforced in an account, and then you can also make changes to your environment using AWS Control Tower. IAM Access Advisor helps you audit services, service access. It helps you remove any unnecessary permissions and set appropriate permissions, providing the last timestamp when an IAM entity, a user, a role, or a group, accessed an AWS service. Note that the services listed along the bottom of this page here belong to the security tooling account, right? And we'll discuss that in a moment. So the security OU contains the security tooling account and the log archive accounts. We'll talk about the security tooling account first. The security tooling account serves as the admin account for centralized security services designed to enforce guardrails and enable monitoring and response for all member accounts. Doesn't matter what account you have in the org, all member accounts benefit from the security tooling account. This is where your security analysts are going to operate, right? You could have more than one security tooling account if you want. And Security Hub, which we discussed earlier, or at least referenced earlier, ingests data from various sources and enables you to assess, enrich, and prioritize security alerts and posture across accounts. Take a look at the document if you downloaded it for the Security Hub integrations. It'll basically explain what AWS services send data to AWS, or rather to Security Hub, and what data Security Hub can send to third-party solutions, or what data it can ingest from third-party solutions as well. So Amazon Inspector is a vulnerability management service that essentially continuously scans your AWS workloads for vulnerabilities. Security Hub integrates with other services including GuardDuty, Macie, Detective, Inspector, Firewall Manager, Access Analyzer, and so on. You can leverage EventBridge. EventBridge is formerly known as CloudWatch, right? You can leverage EventBridge rules to send findings to your third-party security information event management solution directly from Security Hub. You can also leverage EventBridge and Lambda together to automate response and remediation, introducing essentially a SOAR capability, a security orchestration automation response capability. Keep in mind that Detective relies on machine learning and visualization to generate a so-called unified interactive view of behavior and interaction between your AWS resources. This is a great source to identify any data or issues that might be indicative of suspicious activity between resources. Detective can ingest GuardDuty findings, but ensure GuardDuty is enabled for 48 hours. Otherwise, you won't even have the option to do so. Firewall Manager integrates with AWS organizations and introduces basically a centralized capability to manage AWS WAF roles, AWS Shield Advanced, security group roles, AWS network firewalls, and your Amazon Route 53 Resolver DNS firewall, which we'll talk about in a few. Prior to 2019 rather, you had to do that separately and manually, or you had to use some sort of third-party solution to do that as well. I think I missed some things here. So, yeah, the log archive account ingests and archives all security-related logs. and backs them up into one S3 bucket with the capability to introduce some degree of immutability, durability, integrity, confidentiality. So durability is used to measure the likelihood of data loss in AWS, specifically S3. S3 is designed to provide 11 nines of durability and 4 nines of availability of an object over a given year. Logs are encrypted to ensure confidentiality using S3 server-side encryption. And then CloudTrail does provide the capability to perform some degree of log file integrity validation to ensure that the integrity of your logs. The primary log sources included are CloudTrail, VPC flow logs, CloudFront distribution, and AWS WAF access logs, and then your Route 53 DNS logs. You can also ingest operational logs and application logs, including database logs as well. It's always a good idea to enable MFA delete on your S3 bucket, especially the S3 bucket that contains all your log data, right? You're essentially going to protect against malicious or accidental deletion, right? Not sure how it would be accidental because you actually have to type MFA delete to delete the contents of the log. Also, limit the IAM policy labeled AWS CloudTrail _ full access. That is AWS CloudTrail _ full access. To as few individuals as possible, because essentially that gives any individual with that policy full access to the logs within the CloudTrail, and also the capability to delete. Rely on AWS config to monitor the configuration state of your S3 bucket, right? And then rely on IAM Access Analyzer to monitor access to that S3 bucket, just to keep both security and whoever has access to that security tooling account honest. You will observe, again, a recurring theme in that security service guardrails are deployed with appropriate delegated administration to the security tooling account that we discussed earlier. And you're essentially doing that to ensure a consistent set of guardrails across your AWS organization. So the infrastructure OU contains the network and shared services account. They do provide a significant amount of security value, right? So this, just because it says infrastructure, not security, doesn't mean it doesn't provide some security value. It certainly does. So the network account manages the gateway between your applications and the broader internet. That means that all traffic goes through this network account, inbound and outbound. The inbound VPC can host reverse proxies such as load balancers, application delivery controllers, while the outbound VPC can host forward proxies. Both can do or can perform network address translation. So the flow logs associated with both VPCs end up in the log archive account that we just discussed. The inspection VPC can host firewalls, including intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems. And then you can rely on Route 53 to handle DNS, CloudFront to act as the content delivery network, and certificate manager to manage TLS certificates and keys throughout their life cycle. Keep in mind that certificates provisioned through Certificate Manager can be deployed through Route 53, through the DNS service. AWS Shield offers just your standard distributed denial of service protection at no cost. It's enabled, it's on at no cost by default, with an option to enable Shield Advanced, right? To protect Route 53 resources as well as applications that are running on other resources such as CloudFront distributions, EC2 instances, or any workload sitting behind an elastic load balancer. I do caution you, though, to understand the cost associated with enabling Shield Advanced. It can get pretty expensive fast. You do get, as an additional service, though, if you subscribe to Shield Advanced, you do get WAF, and you do get Firewall Manager, I believe, included. So do consider those trade-offs as well. So AWS WAF is a web application firewall. It essentially monitors HTTP and HTTPS requests. And it monitors those requests destined for your CloudFront distributions, right? Your content delivery network, your application load balancers, your API gateway, so your REST APIs, and then your AppSync GraphQL APIs. GraphQL is just a newer version of an API. AWS updated the SRA in July of this year to include AWS Resource Access Manager. AWS Resource Access Manager enables you to securely share your resources within your AWS account. So many organizations use multiple accounts, right? The multi-account strategy to create those administrative and billing isolation controls or safeguards that we talked about, to also limit the impact of errors. But with Resource Access Manager, you can actually deploy services in one centralized account without creating duplicate services in those multiple AWS accounts that are associated with those workloads. Route 53 Resolver DNS Firewall is essentially a DNS filter. You can filter and regulate outbound DNS traffic to your virtual private cloud, your VPC. And then Network Access Analyzer, which they added as well, helps you identify unintended access to your resources on AWS. The Shared Services account supports the services that applications and teams rely on, such as directory services, metadata services, messaging services. AWS IAM Identity Center is the successor to AWS Single Sign-On, as we discussed earlier, and helps you securely create or connect your workforce identities and manage their access centrally across all AWS accounts. But in addition to enabling SSO for AWS accounts, it also enables SSO for applications, including third-party software as a service applications. So it can act as your Okta, if you will. Systems Manager, which also enabled the management and application workload accounts, enables you to monitor, manage, and update in-scope resources. So Systems Manager can help you monitor CPU utilization, memory utilization. It can also help you patch. It is connector-based or agent-based. Just keep that in mind as well. You can also use Systems Manager to manage systems on-prem if you have a direct connect configured. There exists the option to integrate your self-managed or AWS-managed Active Directory services with AWS IAM Identity Center. Remember, that's essentially AWS SSO. And grant the Active Directory users or groups access to AWS accounts, applications, or both. You can also connect AWS Directory services with self-managed AD services. Note that AWS Directory Services also lets you run Microsoft AD as a managed service. So AWS can manage your Active Directory on your behalf. So the workload OU contains one account per production workload to enable the security, compliance, and access and billing boundaries we talked about, right? This is really the essence of, or the benefit rather, of a multi-account strategy. Now you can place different workloads in different accounts, right? So you can better apply security and compliance safeguards. You can better control access to those specific workloads. You can better enforce billing boundaries so that you understand when finance or accounting come to you and ask you how much is it costing us to run this application or system. You have a well-defined, accurate figure, right, in mind. And so otherwise, if you mixed everything up together, including non-prod and prod, it's really hard to answer those questions. And it's even doubly hard to actually implement security and compliance, especially granular and categorical security and compliance controls or safeguards to those workloads. Let's say that you have a workload that's just HIPAA, right? Processing EPHI. The last thing you want to do is have to apply the same controls, the same safeguards, the same guardrails across the entire organization only because you have an application that you did not segment into a separate account, right? So an application account hosts the primary infrastructure and services associated with a specific workload. For the sake of time, I'm not going to cover all aspects of this particular workload. I will mention that the VPC endpoints in the center there, in the blue circles, they connect your application VPC to other AWS services, right? So you see there you have KMS, you have Systems Manager, Amazon S3 endpoint. Those endpoints essentially, they provide the benefit of communicating between instances in your VPC and other AWS services without sending that traffic outside of AWS. It all traverses within AWS, making it a lot easier to route that traffic, and a lot easier to protect that traffic if there's any sensitive information in that traffic, right? However, always consider creating a separate account for each workload to establish boundaries. Again, these boundaries will help you delegate access and authorization controls to admins and engineers. They'll help you apply categorical and granular security and compliance safeguards and controls, those guardrails. And they'll help you accurately allocate AWS costs to departments, to projects, to specific applications, help you with forecasting, that sort of thing. So, by the way, not every workload or environment needs to deploy every security service. And creating separate accounts for each workload allows you to categorically apply security and compliance monitoring and safeguarding, or safeguards between them, right? So again, using the example of HIPAA, you can apply specific guardrails, security and compliance controls to a HIPAA workload without having to apply the same security and compliance guardrails to a PCI workload. Some of that, of course, will overlap, but there may be differences, and that's where you can get pretty granular in your approach. Okay, so water break. So this example, this case study, is not subject to NDA. This is actually a video that's posted on YouTube that describes how William Hill leveraged AWS to essentially protect itself from distributed denial of service attacks. So so AWS sponsors a video series called "This Is My Architecture," and if you haven't seen the series, please do. They basically document case studies where AWS, in conjunction or cooperation with the customer, describes specific solutions that they've created to solve very specific problems within AWS, right? It's called "This Is My Architecture." And for a year, I was the interim head of security for Caesars Sportsbook. Caesars Entertainment acquired William Hill. William Hill was rebranded as Caesars Sportsbook. Before the acquisition, though, in 2016, the acquisition didn't occur until 2020. In 2016, William Hill experienced a DDoS attack. It was November-ish, November 1st, 2016. William Hill, now Caesars Sportsbook, was the target of a distributed denial of service attack that leveraged the Mirai botnet. At its peak, it was generating 177 gigabytes per second. It overwhelmed William Hill's online service, which was hosted on-prem at the time, rendering them unavailable for a period. In response, William Hill decided on a very strategic move. They decided to migrate services to AWS to essentially leverage AWS Shield Advanced and AWS WAF to protect against DDoS and web application attacks, but also to take advantage of the extensibility, right? The elasticity that AWS offers, right? So, to begin with, all sportsbook requests, all traffic is handled by CloudFront, right? And relying on AWS Shield Advanced and AWS WAF to mitigate those layer 3, layer 4 DDoS attacks, such as SYN floods, and as well as the application layer attacks such as HTTP floods. So because they subscribe to AWS Shield, they also get AWS WAF, and now, as recently announced, Firewall Manager. With AWS Shield Advanced, they can write customized WAF rules to mitigate sophisticated application layer attacks. I think WAF now offers bot protection. They can deploy them immediately too. They can also set up rules to proactively and automatically block bad traffic to respond to security incidents as they occur. Subscribing to Shield Advanced also gives them access to a 24/7 team called the AWS Shield Response Team that can assist with incident response, going so far as to write these rules for you, right? Next, they route that traffic to Route 53. Within Route 53, they have 2 Route 53 hosted zones. One's for non-sensitive traffic, and one's for sensitive traffic, like authentication traffic. That sensitive traffic is destined for an EC2 instance, which also hosts an F5 big IP WAF as an added layer of protection that supplements the AWS WAF. The ELB and EC2 instances are hosted within a dedicated AWS account labeled an ingress account. Once the traffic traverses the ELB and is evaluated by the F5 WAF within their DDoS mitigation service, the traffic is routed to one of several AWS accounts via VPC peering. VPC peering essentially connects two VPCs together. Where certain traffic is, where certain services are hosted, where certain workloads are hosted. Any traffic destined for applications or services hosted on premises is routed to co-location data centers over an AWS Direct Connect. And links are on-premises network with their AWS network. For an added layer of protection, they send the CloudFront standard and real-time logs that contain detailed information about every user request that CloudFront receives, right? Standard logs in AWS parlance are also known as access logs or real-time logs. The logs provide them with detailed information about requests made to a CloudFront distribution in real time. Literally, logs are delivered within seconds of receiving the request. They also rely on third-party logs to monitor, analyze, and respond. They forward these logs to an S3 bucket where they await aggregation and parsing by their security information and event management solution. Any offending IP address is then automatically stored within a DynamoDB table along with an expiration date to accommodate for the ephemeral nature of IP addresses, right? They're acted upon by that Lambda function that you see there on the top right, which basically writes the offending IP to the AWS WAF. Yes, it's not a great practice to rely on IP addresses, but pretty effective when you automate it, right? Obviously, those IP addresses are null routed for a period. I can't say how long, but a period. And of course, they drop off after some time, right? Let's see, what else is important about this? So with AWS WAF, though, and remember, this was done in 2016. With AWS WAF, the consensus is now that AWS WAF is enterprise ready, right? In essence, William Hill may not really need that F5 anymore. The AWS WAF has a lot of feature parity with other third-party solutions as well, including bot mitigation. So if you want to implement the AWS SRA, it's as easy as going to their repo and reviewing their CloudFormation templates, right? Now that's if you want to deploy it prescriptively. Obviously, you're going to have to do some refactoring if you want to revise your approach, right? But if you want to do it prescriptively, the CloudFormation templates are already written, and they're hosted in the Amazon Web Services SRA repo in GitHub. Some additional resources that you might find useful include some of the models that we've talked about, the frameworks we've talked about, so the Cloud Adoption Framework, the Well-Architected Framework. There is a document that describes the multi-account strategy. And then there's a great document, it's a fun implementation guide called the AWS Centralized Logging Guide that you could probably work through in an afternoon and then tear down. Make sure you tear it down though, because it can the costs generate pretty quickly. So that's it. So again, we are a Line Technology Group. We are headquartered here in Raleigh, North Carolina. We focus on cloud, security, and other areas. We are also a technology reseller. We do focus on consulting, however, with a strong focus again on cloud and security. If you have any additional questions or need assistance, then feel free to reach out to me. My vCard's on the slide there. And is that neat? I love it. I love Colin. Colin's our marketing guy. Thank you very much, guys. I appreciate your time.